Last week we considered the Bible's position on the believer in relation to civil government. We observed what the government should do as God's servant, and that is punish evildoers and reward and support good in people and in society. We read there in Romans, it's established for your good. And lawlessness and anarchy are the result of no government. We saw that. And as believers, we should do what we can to support and to put into power those whose administrations are more closely aligned, their policies, their platforms more closely aligned with righteous principles and the teachings of the Bible, among which are liberty and freedom of religion. And we saw that portion there in 1 Timothy where we are to pray for our leaders that we can lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. It's said in that portion, this is good and acceptable in the sight of God. And we saw there's nothing unspiritual, I believe, about genuine patriotism and in loving and supporting the good of our country. That portion there in Jeremiah said we should seek the welfare of our country because in its welfare you have welfare. And then in verse 17 of chapter 2 in 1 Peter, we closed that sermon there with that verse that's in the form of a motto: honor all people, that is, treat everybody with respect, and love the brotherhood. We heard that even again this morning. Particularly love for fellow believers. And then give God the reverence that belongs to Him, says fear God. And lastly, honor the king. Seems like that fits with what Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Well, equally difficult today is this relationship that we're going to be viewing, and that is the believer under authority. And one thing that stands out to me is that the Bible is not just a theological book, but rather it's the power of the gospel to change people's lives and cause them to live in the trenches of daily life as Christians, powerfully as Christians. It transforms from within, and it produces a life that's lived outwardly. There was a German philosopher that said, show me your redeemed life and I'll be inclined to believe in your Redeemer. That's a pretty powerful statement. A redeemed life how? Because we come to church and talk theology and doctrine? No, it's a redeemed life, changed, and from here taken out into the world. You all have lives to live. And you have circles of influence and spheres of relationships. How do we live those out? That really reflects on our life, our changed life, transformed life. So we take up the reading today in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is it there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. So this relationship, servants and masters, Rome was full of slaves and bondservants. Someone estimated that approximately 1 in every 3 was in some form of servitude. And the word translated here as servant has the meaning of a domesticated, indentured servant. The term slave is too harsh of a word right here for this verse anyway. It brings up memories in our mind of the horrible degradation of American slaves in early American history, and slaves in forced hard labor and things like that. But this word is a little bit softer than that. It's more of an indentured servitude, but nonetheless, the service was involuntary, and their social standing was less than others in society. A household servant didn't have legal freedom. He was indentured to that household. He couldn't go as he pleased and do whatever he wanted. They were different from a day laborer who would hire himself out on a voluntary basis for an agreed upon wage, kind of like a private independent contractor would be today. You remember that parable Jesus told of the landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Remember that parable? And he said, "Why have you been standing here idle all day long?" And they said, "Because no one hired us." Well, that's a different situation than what's before us today. Those guys there would be a labor pool kind of in the town square, and if you needed a bunch of people to harvest your vineyard, you'd go hire a bunch of guys, agree upon their wage, and that's how that parable went. That's an illustration of that type of worker, but that's not what we're talking about here today. Some of these indentured servants or slaves had risen to a high degree of culture. In a household, you might have a barber, personal barber, or a cook, or a butler, or even a family physician. So they had been skilled, they'd been trained in certain ways, yet they belonged to you, and they were your servant, your slave, if you want to call it that. Tutors, managers of households. Some of them managed and administrated funds, or managed the shop or the property. Again, Jesus told a parable, and he said it's like a man going on a journey, and he called his servants and entrusted to them his property. You remember that? The parable of the talents. Gave one guy 5 talents, another guy 2 talents, and another guy 1 talent. If you were to read Robertson, a commentator, he would say that a talent was $1,000. So that's quite a bit of money there. So some of these servants, they had some pretty heavy responsibility, and they were trusted. Now, the Roman law didn't forbid the master to treat his slaves poorly. You could do that. You could treat them harshly if you wanted to. The law didn't prevent you from doing that. You could condemn them to hard labor. You could lash them severely. But public opinion was normally what ruled in that matter, and it asserted itself into the situation, and a master wouldn't treat his slave or his servant that poorly because people didn't like that. They looked down on it. Not all slaves were treated cruelly. Some were better cared for than a lot of free men. And some were greatly loved. Do you remember that centurion that came to the Lord Jesus? It says there in the Gospels, a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. And he sought out the Lord Jesus to heal his servant. And of course the Lord did that. So that's a case where a servant was loved and valued. Some slaves would contract for life to a good master, at least in the Jewish system. You recall that beloved illustration. He takes his ear, puts it on the doorpost, they drive an awl through it, and he says, I'll not leave my master. And committed himself for life to a good master. A slave might be permitted to purchase his freedom with a sum of money that he saved up over time. Some slaves were set free as a result of their master's last will and testament. The good master dies, included in his will, set my slaves free. So it's easy to see how the New Testament has so much to say about this particular social level. And this portion, it applies to bondservants in a broad sense, but the term that's used here, there's nothing in the word that would limit it only to servants or slaves. Now, none of us are slaves. It's been abolished in our country for a long time now. None of us are indentured servants. But as I look through the congregation, I see a lot of people that are employees, and I'm aware of your different jobs. You have employers. I know different ones of you have bosses or supervisors or heads of your department and so on. So this portion dealing here with the labor force of that day, which was involuntary, is the best New Testament example we have today to translate over into the voluntary service and labor force that we have here. You and your boss. So how is it between you and your boss? You see, this is down where the rubber meets the road. You get up, many of you, and head to work in the morning. You're a Christian. You're not a Christian just on Sunday morning. And it reflects how you live your life in the workplace. And so the title of the sermon this morning is Workplace Christians. These principles, these instructions that we have here and in other portions that we'll look at briefly a little later on in the sermon, they're timeless and they would apply to any service that's rendered, whether it's voluntary or involuntary as it was in those days. So the word is submissive. Be submissive. Servants, be submissive to your masters. Now, this is oftentimes difficult. It's not easy to do. And the reason is there are two types of masters listed here, or two types of employers, two types of bosses, two types of department heads. Now, I worked for almost 30 years in the workforce as a construction worker. And there were plenty of bosses that were unreasonable. There were some bosses that were really good ones. And it was fun to get up and go to work then, almost. If you have a job where you can say it's fun to go to work, that's a great thing. It really is a good thing. And God established work, and we're blessed to have it. Before sin ever entered into the world, God gave Adam and Eve something to do in the garden. So work is blessed of God. It's instituted of God. And if you have a job where your boss is good and, the words here, gentle, some versions say considerate, then it's a pleasure. There's not a problem to be submissive. But now it might not be that way for you. At least it might not be that way all the time. Bosses come and go, you know. Situations change on the job. So Christians ought to submit to the authority of a supervisor. That's the principle taught here. Unless what is required of them is morally wrong, or it's against the teachings of the Bible, or it's illegal. And sometimes that happens. You might be told by your boss to lie to a customer, for instance, or a supplier, or to falsify some report, or to hide or misrepresent income, or overcharge for services. You see, those kinds of things come up all the time out there in the world. And so here you have someone who says, I'm a Christian. You're in the workplace. The boss says, do this. What do you do? Well, the verses tell us we have to submit, but here are situations that you cannot submit to. It's the same principle we had in relation to the government last Sunday. So here's this boss, and he's unreasonable or harsh, as the NIV version says, or the ESV says unjust. Those that are unreasonable. The word actually in the Greek, they tell me, is skolios. And we know medically what scoliosis is. It's where your spine is curved. It goes off in the wrong direction. And so it lends us a little bit of illustration, maybe, to this crooked boss. He's twisted. He's warped. So when the standard is good and gentle and considerate, he veers off from that. He's not that way. He's the opposite. I say he, I mean he or she. It's not gender related. So these servants, some of them had masters that were unreasonable. And what was the word to them? The word to them was, even though this one is unreasonable, you're a believer, submit. Submit to that master. Now, it seems in our case, an employee-employer relationship, that where there's a mechanism put in place to seek a fair resolution, the Christian isn't wrong to pursue that. If you have that opportunity, and many places, you could file a grievance, you could request something, you could push it up the chain higher. Oftentimes, it might result in your dismissal or some other thing even worse than the situation that you're in now. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the Bible doesn't say that would be wrong for a Christian to do that if there's some mechanism put in place to appeal for justice. But where there's no recourse available and you're being mistreated by a harsh or an unreasonable supervisor, the word of the Bible is submit. And not only that, it says regard with all respect. I believe that means honor the boss's directives. If it's not illegal, immoral, against the teachings, the principles of the Bible, submit to it as a believer. Honor the boss and his directives. What is the reason for such a radical thing? And you be radical. You stand out for sure. Well, in verse 19, it starts with the word for, and that means I'm about ready to give you the reason for acting like this. Because God is pleased with it. It finds favor with God. When we're conscious of God in the midst of suffering unjustly, you didn't deserve it, but nevertheless, here you are. And it doesn't downplay the amount of grief or mental anguish that comes as a result of undeserved harsh treatment. It's understood in the text. But how we respond to it can really be pleasing in the eyes of God. God has a high estimation of submitting, even though the boss is unreasonable. There's glory in it. John MacArthur said, favor with God is found when an employee, treated unjustly, accepts his poor treatment, committing the matter to God's sovereign care, rather than responding in anger, hostility, discontent, arrogance, or rebellion. Wayne Grudem says, the trusting awareness of God's presence and care is the key to pleasing God in unjust suffering. It's the confidence that God will ultimately right all wrongs, which enables a Christian to submit to an unreasonable or harsh master without resentment, rebelliousness, self-pity, or despair. So, bearing up under sorrows, as it's said there in verse 19, for being conscious of God in it. Now, it could be pointed out, and it is pointed out in verse 20, it's not just any endurance of harsh treatment that pleases God. There are plenty of people, and they know by their actions they deserve what they're getting. And so they somehow stoically take it. That can be nothing more than stubborn pride. I'll show him I can take anything he throws at me. You see, there's an example of that. But they deserved it all along. Now, in that case, there's nothing to commend. But when a person does good and suffers for it, and when human nature wants revenge, and all of our human nature wants that, we want to be vindicated, we want to get even. When human nature wants revenge, when human nature wants to become insubordinate, I'll make him pay. I won't do what he wants me to do over here. I'll do less over here. I'll show him. Or even hateful. Some bosses are so bad, the temptation is to hate that person. Under those conditions, it's commendable in the eyes of God to bear it patiently, even though it goes against all of our natural inclinations. This is radical Christianity here. Augustine said, "Heal me of this lust of mine to always vindicate myself." Now that's credit in the eyes of God when a person bears up under unjust suffering like that. Jesus in Luke's Gospel in chapter 6, 3 times he said, "What credit is that to you?" And 3 times he said, "Even sinners do the same." One time was, when you love those who love you. That's pretty easy to do. What credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. When you loan to others that can pay you back, what credit is that to you? The world does that. When you do good to those who do good to you, Jesus says, what credit is that to you? Even the world does it. But here's a Christian in the workplace who's treated poorly while he's trying to do a good job. I mean, sincerely. And that person is treated poorly, but yet he bears up under it with a consciousness toward a higher demand, a higher standard, and that's God. That finds favor with God. That's praiseworthy. The higher motivation of a Christian in the workplace is this: how does it reflect on God in the minds of others? Because we're not just Christians while we're seated here. You got jobs you're going to go to tomorrow, most of you. So we don't want to discredit Christianity with some attitude that reflects poorly on our profession as a Christian. We don't want to become lazy in our service. We don't want to develop a complaining spirit. We don't want, as a result of being mistreated while trying to do good, we don't want to then produce shoddy workmanship because we've got a bad attitude. Christian employees ought to be the most reliable with the best attitudes and possibly be the most valuable to their bosses. Why? So that God is honored by that in the workplace, by the service of his people. So the boss, he ought to observe this kind of Christianity. Elevates the performance of this employee in his daily work, and it's not just some kind of formal ritual that he practices on Sunday morning. The world is full of that. People that go to church on Sunday morning and then on Monday they're no different than anybody else around them. Formal, ritualistic religion. But that's not what's being talked about right here. Negatively, if Christianity and its doctrines allowed an employee to have a bad attitude and a complaining spirit and a poor work ethic and disrespect and stab the boss in the back, it would reflect on Christ, right? You say you're a Christian. Now, on the other hand, positively, if the boss or the supervisor or the department head or whoever it is, they would be compelled to respect any religion that made this particular employee honest and industrious and respectful and obedient and morally consistent, even if it was hard and it costed them. They'd be inclined to worship God. It's a glorious advertisement for Christianity in that case. So this isn't some sort of hopeless, impractical advice that Peter's given right here, but it's a real way to affect the world around us. And it's available to every believer. So this is glorious Christian service right here. It's legitimate. It's a legitimate way to serve God as a Christian. It's a high level of service to God as a Christian, as high as anything I'm doing here in the pulpit. You being called to live that way in spite of being poorly treated for it. That's a glorious way to serve Christ. In fact, that's what most are called to. Now, I want us to look at one portion here. If we turn in our Bibles to chapter 2 of Titus, we'll just make a few comments here because it takes it to a little bit different level. In Titus chapter 2, verse 9, urge bondslaves, same people group, to be subject to their own masters in everything. Well, how is that, Paul? How should that look? Well, first, be well-pleasing. Second, not argumentative. Third, not pilfering. Fourth, showing all good faith. And what's the reason? So that they'll adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in every respect. So you see, how we live out our lives, it matters how we live our lives. And our personal testimony out in the world, that matters. It's a big deal. And the testimony on the church that's reflected by our personal testimony in the world, that matters. and the reflection ultimately of God as a result. That matters. And we're daily revealing where we're at in regard to God by how we live our lives out in the world. And so it's living to show all around us, everybody around us, that there's reality in the gospel. There's a great Scottish preacher named Alexander MacLaren. Some of you might know him. I read him every now and then. And he's credited with saying this: they read us a great deal more than they read the Bible. So the world around us, we don't want to be hearers of the word and not doers of it. Earlier on in Titus, right here in this very chapter, a few verses before, so that the opponent will have nothing bad to say about us. You disarm them that way. There's a way to live your life that disarms them. What they say then is nothing more than a lie. There's no truth to it. You take the argument away. So, righteous living in the work world. MacArthur says godly character in the world is the greatest evangelistic strategy. It seems like that could sure be true. You might not be able to theologically order all of your doctrine in an attempt to worship, to witness to a coworker. But if that person knows that you love the Lord Jesus, if that person knows that you're a Christian, and they're watching you, reading you more than they read their Bible, and how you react in the situations that you find yourselves in, good boss, bad boss, then that says a lot to them evangelistically. Not only does it say a lot to them, it reveals where you are with God. Whether you're a hypocrite or not, whether your religion is just some sort of formal ritual that you do on a Sunday morning. So submissiveness under the authority is what the word is here in Titus chapter 2. Be subject, that is, under authority. Be satisfying, that's what well-pleasing is meaning right there. Not argumentative. That means not speaking out against, not mouthing off, not talking back, not backstabbing the boss, rebellion in some form of argument. But the Bible would allow you, I believe, to go through proper channels to attempt to get a difficult situation corrected. So what's spoken about here is not rebelling against authority, not undermining the boss. Then employees, Christian employees, says not pilfering. What's pilfering? Well, it's petty theft in the workplace. That doesn't go on, does it? It goes on everywhere. For a fact, I know that. So it's not pilfering, not setting aside for yourself, literally, embezzling or keeping back something. At one point in time, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimated, I don't know if it's true or not, I have really no way to verify it, but they estimated that 30% of businesses fail because of employee theft. That's a pretty high amount. That's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. At one point, the FBI called employee theft the fastest growing crime in America. So you, Christian, in the workplace, don't be like that. Don't be known as that. It reflects on your personal testimony, the testimony of the church, and then ultimately the testimony of God. I used this little anecdote that I found on the internet before in regard to this point, maybe when I preached through this portion in Titus when we went through that book, but there was device called the whirlwind anti-theft grinding hood. What is that, you say? Well, let me tell you. This is the advertisement. This is the pitch for it, the sales pitch for it. Let's face it, the pitch goes. When working around so much precious metal, some polishers are tempted to supplement their income with your gold. Take away that temptation. The whirlwind grinding hood, when used with a good dust collector, makes losses a thing of the past. 100% thief-proof. Grinding collection cannot be circumvented. So here's a company capitalizing on employee theft and developing a hood to prevent it because there's a market for it in the gold polishing industry anyway. So not pilfering. And then with all good faith, that's loyalty. The Christian ought to give ample evidence that he's loyal, he can be trusted, and it indicates faithfulness. Now, if a servant behaved like Paul is setting forth right here in Titus, he would have stood out from the crowd, and you would the same way as an employee if you behave like this. If the group knows that you're a Christian and this is you right here, you stand out. Most slaves resented their lot in life. They fought back. They had a sulky attitude, an insolent tongue. There was petty thievery going on, trying to get by with as little work as possible. I knew guys on the job, and the joke was, back then, if this guy worked as hard for the company as he works trying to get out of doing work, he would do good. And you see that. I mean, this guy's really trying hard to avoid the boss and going here and there to keep from getting assigned a new assignment and drawing something out to keep from getting another job given. He works to try and avoid getting more work. So that's the way that it is out in the work world. In Ephesians 6, we're told that we should do our work as to the Lord. And I'll just read that portion, Ephesians 6:5. Bondservants, again, that people group, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. That's quite a thought. Get up and go to work tomorrow like Christ is your boss. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he'll receive back from the Lord, whether he's bondservant or free. That's Ephesians 6:5-8. So as to the Lord. Colossians has another portion I'll read to you in Colossians chapter 3. Bondservants, obey in everything, those who are your earthly masters, not by way of external service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever work you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you'll receive the inheritance as your reward. He says the same thing again there. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. That's Colossians 3:22-25. Now, if we could grab hold of these thoughts right here, they could transform your life in the workplace. What I'm doing here, whether I'm being praised for it or whether I have an ungrateful, unreasonable boss, whatever the situation might be, whatever I'm doing here as to the Lord. He's my boss. And I can do that joyfully, heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. to gain God's smile and approval, whether my boss likes it or not. So there are bad situations that we can live down by the power of the Holy Spirit in the workplace. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 1, let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, and the reason so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. It reflects what you do, what you say, how you live, in the workplace, wherever, what you do, what you say, reflects on you, your testimony, reflects on the church, and it reflects on God. That's the principle. Whether it's indentured servitude that's involuntary, or whether it's the American picture of labor, getting up, going to work under a boss. So with all of our preaching and all of our speaking about faith and all of that, it won't matter what you say if your life is a contradiction. The conclusion then is that your God is not a God who transforms people, as is claimed, because you're the same as everyone else. And thus God is dishonored. So we have a high standard, don't we? And we have a high reason for living the way that we live. And so may God help us. I wish I would have been convicted by these things earlier on in my career. I really do. Because there's a lot in my past that I'm ashamed of. This very thing. Not reacting well, not living rightly out in the work world, and not being a very good workplace Christian. So may the Lord give us help in these ways. Well, that's all for today.